When Lee Radziwill died, most headlines focused on her famous last name, her glamorous life, and her connection to one of America's most legendary families. But behind the funeral tributes and carefully worded statements was a much more complicated story. The person who knew that story better than anyone was her daughter, Tina Radziwill, a woman who spent most of her life avoiding publicity. Years after her mother's death, details hidden inside Lee's final wishes, family relationships, and private struggles began revealing a truth that was far different from the elegant image the public had seen for decades. For most of her life, Lee Radziwill lived with a reality that very few people could understand. She was born Caroline Lee Bouvier into one of America's most prominent families, but from an early age, she was constantly compared to her older sister, Jacqueline Bouvier, who would later become Jacqueline Kennedy. According to biographer J. Randy Taraborelli in his book Jackie, Janet, and Lee, the sisters were both extremely close and intensely competitive. Family members often described Lee as the pretty one and Jackie as the smart one, labels that followed them throughout adulthood. At first, Lee appeared to have the more glamorous future. She married before Jackie did and quickly entered international high society. After marrying Polish aristocrat Prince Stanislaw Radziwill, she became Princess Lee Radziwill and moved comfortably among royalty, celebrities, politicians, and wealthy socialites. Her circle eventually included names such as Truman Capote, Andy Warhol, Rudolf Nureyev, and Leonard Bernstein. Fashion magazines regularly placed her on best-dressed lists, and many designers considered her one of the most influential style icons of her era. But everything changed when Jackie married John F. Kennedy. Once Kennedy entered the White House, Lee suddenly found herself standing next to perhaps the most famous woman in the world. Even though the sisters remained close, Lee's own identity became increasingly tied to her sister's public image. In her memoir, Happy Times, Lee admitted that Jackie frequently invited her to travel and spend time together because of their close relationship and shared sense of humor. Yet historians have often pointed out that no matter what Lee accomplished, public attention always drifted back to Jackie. According to Taraborelli, Lee spent years trying to create an independent identity through theater projects, interior decorating, public relations work, and social influence. She became a respected figure in fashion and culture, but she could never completely escape the Kennedy shadow. That struggle shaped much of her adult life and would continue long after Jackie was gone. Ironically, the person who eventually understood the cost of that struggle better than anyone was Lee's daughter, Tina. While the public focused on the glamorous princess, Tina witnessed the private woman behind the headlines. And as Lee entered the final years of her life, that private reality became increasingly difficult to hide. For all the stories written about Lee Radziwill's beauty, fashion influence, famous friendships, and royal connections, the defining tragedy of her life had nothing to do with Jackie Kennedy or the public spotlight. It was the loss of her son, Anthony Radziwill. Those who knew Lee personally often said that no event affected her more deeply than watching her only son fight a disease she could not stop. Anthony Stanislaw Albert Radziwill was born in Lausanne, Switzerland, shortly after Lee married Prince Stanislaw Radziwill. Unlike many celebrity children, Anthony worked hard to build a career based on his own accomplishments. After attending Choate Rosemary Hall and graduating from Boston University, he entered the television industry and quickly earned respect as a producer and executive. According to industry records, he won a prestigious Peabody Award for his work in television, a major achievement that placed him among the most promising young media executives of his generation. Everything changed when Anthony was diagnosed with testicular cancer. Reports indicate that the diagnosis came while he was still a relatively young man with his career accelerating. The disease eventually spread, turning what began as a frightening diagnosis into a years-long battle for survival. During this period, Anthony married journalist Carol Radziwill, who would later become known to television audiences through The Real Housewives of New York City. However, long before reality television entered her life, Carol was a wife helping her husband fight a devastating illness. In interviews given years later, Carol described Anthony as remarkably courageous throughout his illness. Speaking to Bravo, she recalled that even on the final day of his life, he continued fighting. She explained that because Anthony never stopped battling the disease, neither of them truly had the opportunity to prepare emotionally for the end. That memory remained one of the most painful aspects of his death. For Lee, the experience was equally devastating. According to Carol's later reflections, their relationship changed dramatically during Anthony's illness. The traditional mother-in-law and daughter-in-law dynamic disappeared as both women focused entirely on helping the same person survive. They became allies facing a common crisis. Every treatment, every medical update, and every setback brought them closer together. When Anthony died at age 40, the loss was made even more painful by the timing. Just weeks earlier, his cousin and lifelong friend John F. Kennedy Jr. had died in a plane crash alongside Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and Lauren Bessette. Anthony and John had grown up together and were frequently described as being more like brothers than cousins. The Kennedy family was therefore forced to endure two devastating losses within a very short period. The death left a permanent mark on Lee. Friends noticed changes in her outlook and priorities during the years that followed. Publicly, she continued attending social events and maintaining her image, but privately she was carrying the grief of a mother who had buried her son. That grief would shape many of her later relationships, especially the one she maintained with Carol. Yet while the public focused on Anthony's death, another important figure quietly remained by Lee's side through the years that followed. Her daughter Tina, who would eventually become the central figure in the story of Lee's final chapter. While much of the public attention surrounding Lee Radziwill focused on her famous sister, her friendships with celebrities, and later the tragedy involving Anthony, another important story was unfolding almost entirely out of public view. That story involved her daughter, Anna Christina Radziwill, better known as Tina. Unlike nearly every famous member of the Kennedy-Bouvier-Radziwill circle, Tina spent most of her adult life avoiding publicity. She rarely gave interviews, rarely appeared in headlines, and never seemed interested in turning her family name into a public career. Born in New York and raised between extraordinary privilege and extraordinary family pressure, Tina grew up witnessing a side of Lee that outsiders rarely saw. She watched her mother navigate social circles filled with royalty, politicians, artists, and celebrities. She also witnessed the emotional toll that came with belonging to one of America's most scrutinized families. While Lee spent decades being compared to Jackie Kennedy, Tina grew up observing how those comparisons affected her mother's confidence, relationships, and sense of identity. Unlike Anthony, whose career placed him in the public eye, Tina consistently chose privacy. Although she had some involvement in entertainment projects and briefly attracted media attention through her marriage to Columbia University physician Dr. Ottavio Arancio, she never embraced celebrity culture. Friends and observers frequently described her as reserved, intelligent, and uncomfortable with the attention that naturally followed her family name. As Lee entered her later years, Tina became increasingly important in her daily life. After the deaths of Jackie Kennedy, John F. Kennedy Jr., Anthony Radziwill, and many of Lee's closest friends, the social circle that had once surrounded her began shrinking dramatically. People such as Truman Capote, Andy Warhol, and Rudolf Nureyev were gone. The glamorous jet-set world that defined much of Lee's life was slowly disappearing. Through all of those losses, Tina remained one of the few constants. Reports from people close to the family suggest that Lee's final years were far quieter than many outsiders imagined. Although she continued to be celebrated as a fashion icon and cultural figure, she was no longer living the non-stop international lifestyle that had once made her famous. She spent much of her time in New York, surrounded by books, memories, artwork, and a smaller circle of trusted friends and family members. According to accounts published after her death, Lee remained intellectually engaged until the end. She continued following literature, theater, fashion, and politics. Visitors often remarked that despite becoming physically frail, her mind remained sharp and her curiosity remained intact. Tina witnessed those final years firsthand, observing not the glamorous princess portrayed in magazines, but the aging mother behind the public image. When Lee Radziwill died in February, many people assumed her estate would quietly pass to her family without controversy. For a few weeks, that appeared to be exactly what would happen. Public attention focused on her funeral, the famous guests who attended, and the tributes celebrating her remarkable life. Then details from her final will began to emerge, and suddenly people started asking questions that had never been asked while she was alive. According to documents later obtained by Daily Mail TV, Lee signed her 16-page last will and testament less than 5 months before her death. The document revealed something that immediately attracted public attention. Her daughter Anna Christina Tina Radziwill was clearly established as the primary beneficiary of her estate, reportedly valued at approximately $50 million. Given that Anthony had died years earlier, this outcome was not surprising. What surprised many observers was who did not appear in the will. One of the most discussed omissions was Carol Radziwill. For years, the public had viewed Carol and Lee as unusually close. Following Anthony's death, they had maintained a relationship that lasted nearly 2 decades. In a tribute written after Lee's passing, Carol described intimate dinners at Lee's apartment, conversations about books, fashion, art, and life, and a friendship that survived long after her husband's death. She recalled that Lee always continued introducing her as her daughter-in-law, even though Anthony was gone and there were no children linking them together. Yet when the will became public, Carol's name appeared nowhere in the document. The omissions did not stop there. Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg, Lee's niece and the daughter of Jackie Kennedy, was also absent. So were Caroline's children. The exclusions immediately fueled speculation about long-standing family dynamics. Although there was no public evidence of major disputes, the document demonstrated that Lee's final plans centered almost entirely on Tina. The will also shed light on another subject that had followed Lee for decades: money. Throughout her life, reports frequently suggested that Lee struggled financially despite her glamorous image and high-profile marriages. The will revealed the existence of important trusts connected to her mother, Janet Lee Auchincloss, and another trust established for Lee's benefit that involved Jackie Kennedy Onassis. These financial arrangements helped explain how Lee maintained her lifestyle even during periods when observers believed she was experiencing financial difficulties. Perhaps the most revealing detail was not about money at all. Instead of naming a family member to oversee her affairs, Lee selected 2 longtime friends, Hamilton South and attorney Martin O'Connor, as co-executors. The choice suggested a tremendous level of trust in people outside her immediate family. For Tina, however, the will represented something much larger than an inheritance. It was the final statement of a mother who had spent decades navigating family loyalty, personal loss, and public scrutiny. And when Tina later reflected on her mother's life, the conversation became less about wealth and more about what Lee had truly endured behind closed doors. If there was one uncomfortable truth that emerged in the years following Lee Radziwill's death, it was not a shocking family scandal, a legal battle, or a secret feud. Instead, it was something far more human. The truth was that behind the titles, wealth, famous friends, and glamorous photographs was a woman who spent much of her life carrying losses that never completely healed. For decades, the public viewed Lee through the lens of privilege. She was a princess, She attended the world's most exclusive events. She traveled with royalty, artists, and political leaders. Yet when people closest to her spoke after her death, a different picture emerged. The woman Tina knew was not simply a social icon. She was a daughter who lost both parents, a sister who buried Jackie Kennedy, an aunt who mourned John F. Kennedy Jr., a friend who outlived many of the most important people in her life, and most painfully, a mother who lost her only son. That reality became increasingly visible during the final years of her life. In interviews given late in life, Lee spoke openly about regret, loss, and aging. During a conversation with the New York Times, she admitted that everyone has regrets and said people who claimed otherwise were either lying or narcissistic. What made that statement significant was that it came from someone who had spent decades being viewed as a symbol of elegance and privilege. Instead of presenting herself as a woman who had lived a perfect life, she acknowledged that there were many things she wished had happened differently. She also addressed another misconception that followed her for years. Many outsiders assumed she must have spent her life envying Jackie Kennedy, yet Lee specifically rejected that idea. She said that while she had regrets, she did not have envy. By the time she reached her 80s, she appeared more interested in reflecting on experiences than competing with anyone. For someone whose life had long been defined by comparisons to her sister, that was a remarkable admission. The people who spent time with Lee during her final years consistently described someone who remained intellectually curious despite physical decline. Carol Radziwill wrote that even in her 80s, Lee still possessed the same sharp mind, curiosity, wit, and strong opinions she had always carried. She remained engaged with books, culture, politics, fashion, and the world around her. Those qualities survived long after the glamour faded. Perhaps that is why Carol's tribute resonated with so many people after Lee's death. She wrote that Lee was never truly living in anyone's shadow. The statement directly challenged one of the most common narratives attached to Lee throughout her life. For decades, journalists had framed her story as the tale of a woman overshadowed by Jackie Kennedy. Carol, who knew her privately, argued the opposite. She described Lee as a force of nature in her own right and ended with a line that would become one of the most quoted descriptions of her legacy. She was never in the shadow of anything. She was the sun. For Tina Radziwill, that may be the lasting truth that remained after everything else was gone. Beyond the headlines, beyond the estate, beyond the family myths, there was a mother who spent her life searching for her own identity while enduring extraordinary personal losses. 5 years after her death, the records, interviews, tributes, and family revelations all pointed toward the same conclusion. Lee Radziwill's life was never as perfect as it appeared from the outside, but it was far more complex, resilient, and human than many people ever realized. What do you think was the biggest challenge Lee Radziwill faced during her life, living in Jackie Kennedy's shadow or losing her son Anthony? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. Thanks for watching.